We're taught that ancient Athens birthed democracy, reason, and freedom. But what if I told you the entire Golden Age was funded by a shadow economy of systemic human cruelty? Beneath the gleaming white marble of the Parthenon lies a dark thriller of state-sanctioned disappearances, brutal silver mines, and an empire built on the bones of the forgotten. Welcome to the History Ledger. Today, we expose the terrifying reality of the world's first democracy and why the city that invented freedom was actually powered by chains. The silver mines of Laurion were the engine room of the Athenian dream. Deep beneath the earth, in tunnels so narrow a grown man could barely turn around, thousands of nameless laborers toiled in near-total darkness. They were the invisible foundation of the navy, the currency, and the monuments. While the great orators debated the nuances of justice in the open air of the Pnyx, the air in the mines was thick with dust and the heavy silence of the forgotten. History often forgets that the wealth required to maintain a direct democracy didn't fall from the sky. It was extracted, grain by grain, by a workforce that had no vote, no voice, and no escape. For every free man who stood in the assembly to decide the fate of the state, there were dozens of others whose only function was to ensure he had the leisure time to be a citizen. These laborers were the fuel of the Golden Age, consumed and discarded as the city reached for the stars. The assembly itself was a spectacle of high stakes and hidden fears. Imagine a stage where your neighbor's jealousy could be more dangerous than a foreign army. This was the home of Ostracism, a ritualized purging where the most influential men in the city could be cast out for a decade based on nothing more than a popular whim. A simple shard of ceramic, an ostracon, was the weapon of choice. There were no charges filed, no evidence presented, and no defense allowed. If enough people whispered your name in the marketplace, you were vanished. It was a system designed to prevent tyranny, but it often became a tool for the mediocre to tear down the magnificent. The line between a hero and an exile was as thin as the edge of a clay fragment. In this cradle of democracy, the greatest threat to a man's survival was often his own success. The city demanded brilliance, but punished prominence, creating a culture of constant, low-level paranoia. While the men of Athens gathered in the sunlight to shape the world, the women were relegated to the shadows of the domestic sphere. A respectable woman in the city's golden age was expected to be invisible in public life and silent in private records. They were the silent architects of the household, yet they possessed no legal identity of their own. A woman was always under the guardianship of a male relative, a father, a husband, or even a son. Her life was lived behind walls, her worth measured by her silence and her weaving. The very society that claimed to value the intellect and the individual spirit denied both to half of its population. The vibrant intellectual life of the city was a men's club, built on the assumption that the domestic labor of the excluded was the natural order of the universe. To be a woman in the center of the world was to be a ghost in your own home. The judicial system was perhaps the most volatile element of this grand experiment. There were no professional judges or lawyers, only juries of hundreds of citizens who could be swayed by the rhythm of a speech or the bitterness of a grudge. Justice was a performance art. To be accused was to enter a theater where the facts were often secondary to the emotional resonance of the narrative. The trial of the city's most famous philosopher serves as the ultimate cautionary tale. A man who spent his life questioning everything was eventually silenced by a majority vote of his peers. They didn't execute him for a crime against property or person, but for the perceived danger of his ideas. It was a chilling reminder that in a system governed by the many, the mind of the individual is always at the mercy of the collective's discomfort. The crowd was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the crowd was easily offended. The streets of Athens were a paradox of high philosophy and harsh reality. You could walk past a school where the nature of the soul was being dissected, and moments later, witness the sale of a human being in the marketplace. The economy was so deeply entwined with the ownership of others that the two could not be separated. Even the most progressive thinkers of the time struggled to envision a world where labor was not synonymous with bondage. They saw it as a natural necessity, a prerequisite for the cultivation of the mind. This blind spot in their moral landscape created a society that was both incredibly advanced and fundamentally broken. They reached for the stars while standing on the backs of those they refused to see as human. The scent of jasmine from the gardens mingled with the stench of the slave markets, a duality that defined the very air of the city. The political purges were not limited to the ritual of ostracism. In times of crisis, the democratic mask would often slip, revealing a much more ruthless interior. During the long years of conflict with rival powers, the city-state frequently turned on its own. Suspicion became a civic duty. Those suspected of harboring sympathies for the enemy, or even just questioning the direction of the war, could find themselves facing the ultimate penalty. The same tongues that praised the virtues of free speech were quick to call for the silencing of dissent when the pressure mounted. The fragility of the system was most apparent when it felt threatened. It would devour its own principles to preserve its existence. Loyalty was a moving target, and the city's memory was as short as its temper. The physical city was a testament to this duality. The grand temples were built with the spoils of an empire that extracted tribute from its neighbors under the guise of protection. Athens was a colonial power that preached equality at home while demanding submission abroad. The wealth of the Aegean flowed into the city, funding the arts and the sciences. But it was a wealth gathered through coercion. The league they led was in reality a collection of subordinates who paid for the privilege of Athenian leadership. When a member tried to leave, the response was not a democratic debate, but a demonstration of overwhelming force. The democracy was a luxury funded by the subjugation of those outside the city walls. The white pillars of the Acropolis were not just monuments to gods, but markers of dominance. The concept of the citizen was an exclusive club with a high barrier to entry. To be Athenian was to belong to a lineage, a bloodline that was guarded with fierce jealousy. Those who lived within the city but lacked the proper parentage, the metics, were essential to the city's trade and culture, yet they remained permanent outsiders. They paid taxes and served in the military, but they could never own land or have a say in the laws that governed their lives. The city was a machine that consumed the energy and talent of many, but reserved its rewards for the few. This elitism was baked into the very definition of their democracy, a system that was never intended to be universal. The other was always present, working the docks and balancing the books, but they were never allowed to call the city their own. As the sun set over the Acropolis, the flickering torches in the lower city told a different story than the one found in the history books. They told of the laundresses working late into the night, the foreign traders navigating a maze of prejudice, and the laborers in the silver mines who would never see the monuments their labor funded. The Athenian experiment was a brilliant, flawed, and terrifying leap forward in the human story. It proved that people could govern themselves, but it also demonstrated the terrible cost of that governance when it is built on the exclusion of others. It was a civilization that achieved the impossible by ignoring the intolerable. The beauty of the art was the veil over the brutality of the system. The echoes of this ancient world still vibrate in the structures of modern life. We inherited their logic, their art, and their politics, but we also inherited their shadows. The tension between the ideal of freedom and the reality of exploitation remains a central conflict in the human narrative. Athens was not a finished product. It was a rough draft, written in a language of brilliance and brutality. To understand it, we must look past the polished marble and into the dark corners where the silence is the loudest. The lessons of the first democracy are not found in its triumphs alone, but in the warnings hidden within its systemic failures. We are still reading from their script, repeating their lines, and struggling with their contradictions. The city eventually fell, not just because of external pressure, but because of the weight of its own contradictions. A society that defines freedom by the number of people it can exclude is building on shifting sand. The brilliance of the Athenian mind could not solve the fundamental problem of the Athenian heart, the inability to see the humanity in the other. Their legacy is a map of the heights we can reach and the depths we can sink to when we convince ourselves that our liberty is worth more than someone else's life. The white pillars still stand, stripped of their paint and their gold, serving as a skeletal reminder of a dream that was both beautiful and haunted. The dust of the mines has long since settled, but the questions they raised remain unsettled. When we speak of the birth of democracy, we should speak of it with a sense of gravity. It was a birth that occurred in a landscape of harsh inequalities and violent purges. It was a system that gave the world the concept of the vote, but also the concept of the state-sanctioned disappearance. It taught us how to debate, but also how to manipulate the masses through fear and rhetoric. The dark thriller of Athens is the realization that the cradle of our civilization was also a place of profound systemic cruelty. As we look back through the lens of centuries, the Athenian experiment looks less like a golden age and more like a high-wire act performed over an abyss. Every step forward in philosophy was balanced by a step back into the depths of the silver mines. Every new law for the citizen was a new chain for the non-citizen. The tragedy of the world's first democracy was not that it failed, but that it succeeded so well at the expense of so many. It left us with a blueprint for a world we are still trying to build, and a warning about the foundations we must never use again. The marble is cold. The voices are gone, but the questions they left behind still demand an answer in the silence of the night. The city's end came quietly, then all at once, as the power dynamics of the Mediterranean shifted. But the ideas survived, stripped of their original context and polished for future generations. We took the democracy and left the slavery. We took the philosophy and left the purges. Yet the DNA of the original remains. The tendency to create insiders and outsiders, the impulse to silence the dissenting voice, and the reliance on hidden labor are all ghosts of the Athenian past that continue to haunt the modern world. We are the heirs to a magnificent and terrifying legacy, a story of blood and brilliance that is far from over. The past is never truly dead. It is waiting in the shadows of our own systems. In the end, Athens was a mirror. It reflected the best and worst of what we are. It showed that we are capable of imagining a world of equality and justice, even as we live in a reality of hierarchy and pain. The dark thriller of the first democracy is the story of humanity's struggle to bridge the gap between our highest ideals and our most basic instincts. It is a mystery that remains unsolved, a hypothesis about the nature of power that we are still testing today. The shadows of the Parthenon are long, and they reach all the way to us, whispering that the price of freedom has always been higher than we are willing to admit. We still stand in that shadow, looking for the light, wondering if the cost of the dream will always be the nightmare of the forgotten. The silence of the minds still speaks. It speaks in the gaps of our history books and the hollow spaces of our rhetoric. It reminds us that no civilization is ever as pure as its monuments suggest. To truly honor the legacy of Athens is not to worship its marble, but to interrogate its shadows. We must ask who is working in the darkness today so that we may live in the light. We must ask whose names are being erased so that ours may be remembered. The dark thriller of the ancient world is not a ghost story. It is a live broadcast. The city of freedom was a city of chains. And until we understand how both could exist in the same heart, we are merely tourists in a ruins of our own making. Athens left us a brilliant blueprint for the modern world, but it also left a chilling warning. How much exclusion can a system survive before it becomes the very tyranny it fears? What do you think? Are we still repeating the dark sins of the first democracy in our modern systems today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to unearth more forbidden history and redacted files, hit that subscribe button and join the History Ledger. The past is never dead. It's just waiting in the shadows.